Hello, thank you all for joining us. Hope you go ahead, get comfortable, and we'll get started in just a second. My name is John Kennedy, and I am the Specialist of Education and Engagement at the Indiana Historical Society, and I will be your host tonight. It's great to have so many of you with us for our subject, which is Indiana and the Cold War. I'll be going over a few pieces of logistics before I pass the mic over to Zoe Vorndran, and thank you for joining us, Zoe.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So here at Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana Storyteller, connecting people to the past. We collect paper-based items such as books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, and more to tell Indiana's unique stories. We then find ways to share these stories through publications, exhibits, and events such as this one. Through these documents, we tell the diverse stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we're going to look at Indiana and the Cold War. As many of you know, the Cold War was a conflict that was fought between two great superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. It was one of the more pivotal events of the 20th century, and it had repercussions that continue on to today. Here at Indiana Historical Society, we have an exhibit upstairs on our 4th floor, where we talk about from Indiana with Love, where we go over some of the major contributions that Indiana had towards the Cold War and the United States history in general. And for our event tonight, I will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have any questions as we go along, please drop it in the question and answer section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll keep an eye on them and pepper them in the second half of the program. If you'd like to add anything to the chat box, don't forget to change your response to everyone so that we can all see your thoughts. Keep an eye on the chat, and we'll be dropping in links and URLs throughout the conversation. Don't worry if you miss one, they'll be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded. You can catch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the upcoming weeks. If you enjoy this program, please consider coming back for more. Next month, our History Happy Hour continues with Karen DePau, and we will be discussing costume balls through the ages. And then on November 10th, we will be looking at the contribution of Hoosier Latinos to our state's history with our guest, Nicole Martinez-Legrand, our Multicultural Collections Coordinator. You can stay tuned for upcoming virtual and in-person programs by going to indianahistory.org and checking out our calendar. So Zoe, again, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yes, my pleasure.
So I know that a lot of our guests are probably going to be really familiar with it, but I'm going to have to ask, what was the Cold War?
Yeah, so you sort of hit it right on the nail earlier when you were talking about it. The Cold War was primarily just like an ideological war between, nations that wanted democracy and nations that wanted communism. It cropped up right after the World War II, so all these nations were completely disheveled from the World War. And so you just have these rising leaders who want certain political systems within nations, and it was primarily an ideological war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And it peaked around the 50s and 60s, and then it ended in 1990 when the fall of the Soviet Union happened.
And so it went from essentially it was almost 50 years of just this quiet conflict between two superpowers. And one of the major things that I recall from it was the threat of essentially atomic annihilation. And how that was pretty much a lot of the big fear of the Cold War becoming a hot war.
Yeah. There's a lot of fear surrounding what's going to happen if a nuclear attack happens. And you can see that in some of the national security measures that the United States did, some of the businesses that cropped up in Indiana, like all these things were going into it to try to prevent and protect people from this possible nuclear attack. One of the things that came out of that was a national security protocol called the Ground Observer Corps. And that was, it had been a thing back in World War II, and then it was disestablished and then reestablished when, discontinued after World War II, and then it was reestablished when the Cold War started. And so the Ground Observer Corps was just relied on volunteers who wanted to help watch the sky, I guess, as you will, to prevent or to detect maybe perhaps possible air raids that could be happening. And Indiana had one of their watchtowers, which is still standing. It's in Cairo, Indiana. That was one of those watchtowers where there was 24/7 surveillance. Volunteers would come in for like 4 to 6 hour shifts, maybe no, 2 to 4 hour shifts, and they would just watch the skies and try to alert people if there was possible pending attack.
And we're talking about like from like bombers, right? Or like
Yeah,
what else are you
yeah,
looking out for?
yeah. They're definitely looking out for bombers or planes that might be coming from enemy territory. Just anything that might set off alarms about there being an attack.
So it's a Cold War. Everybody in the United States had heard about it. And
Mhm.
now we're talking about the fact that in an instant, everybody could just be gone because nuclear weapons quickly became like just a gigantic symbol of,
Yeah.
I guess, the Cold War in general. We've actually got a picture here from our exhibit. It's something that actually one of our colleagues, Casey Terry, actually has been covering on our Instagram feed, where he did this delightful video with this cartoon character that I'm about to show you. And let me just bring it up. So yeah, this is Bert. And what can you tell me about Bert?
Yeah, so Bertha Turtle was sort of this figure that sort of taught people how to protect themselves in the event of a danger. And so I think there were like videos and there's like cartoon pamphlets that sort of showed people like you need to duck and cover if there's a nuclear attack. So the premise is he's a turtle. If he seeks or feels that there's going to be danger, then he can just sort of tuck away in his little shell. And so that's sort of the idea of fallout shelters, which became a huge thing in the 50s. And those were just like these huge, like concrete, typically underground shelters that would people were supposed to go into whenever there was this possible air raid or nuclear attack. And so, yeah, Bertha Turtle certainly became sort of this like this educational and promotional thing for take care of yourself and be careful with and always be vigilant, really.
It's funny. My mom's in the audience tonight, and we were discussing this yesterday about duck and cover drills. And I know it sounds probably comical with like, if an atomic bomb goes off and it's like, oh, hide under your desk. But that's kind of the scale we're talking about here, where we're not just talking about a war between two nations. We were talking about essentially a threat to all life on the planet. Because the United States and the Soviet Union, they were massive countries with interests all around the world. And something that related to Bert that I think is just really interesting is this pamphlet, which I found. This is the Passport to Survival, and it is a map of how to evacuate Indianapolis in case of an atomic attack. And I think as our audience can tell, it's really just get out. I just love the fact that it shows all the major roads at the time. This is from 1959. But that was just kind of the sentiment, just you have to get out. And I just love this pamphlet because I guess there really just wasn't a whole lot that you could do in case of an atomic bomb going off.
Right, other than try to just get out of some of the targeted cities, especially cities, those are clearly on the hit list. So yeah, there's not much you can do maybe necessarily in a nuclear attack, but I think they probably needed something to be optimistic about.
Yeah. So we were talking about bomb shelters. How popular were they? Like I've seen them in movies, obviously, but I know that a lot of them were discontinued or I guess filled in. But what else was really like on Americans' minds during the Cold War?
Yeah, I mean, bomb shelters are like super popular. They could be like private or public spaces. Like sometimes you'll see like like I think I was walking around in like Lebanon, Indiana, which is a very random, like smaller city west of here. And on their like courthouse or like one of their like governmental buildings, there's like a fallout shelter like sign. And so I was like, that's really interesting that they still have that. But no, I think there's actually a fallout shelter that was displayed in the Smithsonian that used to be in Fort Wayne. So they must have transported it from this person's backyard. So I feel like, that's sort of kind of a cool thing that they were able to sort of preserve, especially since this is something that they were like super afraid of. And this is how they were going to protect themselves, is through these like small compact shelters. Another thing that was sort of in everybody's mind was just this idea of protection in general. So like along with like the fallout shelters, they did something called Operation Alert, which became an annual drill, basically, essentially, that so the government would just, do a mock air raid drill, and cities across the nation would participate. And this is like a time for them to try to make sure that all their civil defense measures were in place. So like they would try to set up their temporary communication centers, make sure that the wires and radios were working for that. The Red Cross would try to set up like mock hospitals to see, just to see that they were able to do that in the event that, people would need them. There are like temporary kitchens that would be set up during these. And so so this was just, and I think they encouraged like civilians, normal people, to like try to find cover. So like that's another way in which like there's like these national defense measures being put forth. And I think Indianapolis and Fort Wayne were like two of the cities that took part in like the very first one, which happened in like 1954 and then continued for like a decade.
So we're taking part in civil defense with keeping an eye on the skies in case there was a bomber. And we were part of Operation Alert. So can you just tell me real quick, why was the Soviet Union so interested in Indiana?
Yeah, so Indiana actually had quite a few businesses that sort of helped with military production. And I think that's certainly one of the reasons that Indiana was pretty prevalent, or, on the top of their minds. We had Naval Avionics, which was like a very high-end producer and manufacturer and like research and development like center for certain naval ordinances. So like during the World War II, naval avionics was very important in developing the Norden bomb sights, which were used in warfare, and it was used actually to, I think, bomb Hiroshima. And so they were very important in that kind of development. And then in the Cold War, they continued to create missiles and sort of other military equipment that could be used in the event of an attack or as defense.
I think it's just incredible. I used to live actually just around the corner from there, and I was telling Zoe that before the program began. And it's just really weird to just realize that you live so close that if like everything did go just boom, that you lived just around the corner from where a bomb was going to hit. And you mentioned something about the bomb site.
Yeah, the Norden bomb site was, I mean, I don't know much about it, but I do know that it certainly helped with accuracy when dropping bombs. And so that's a huge, development, especially when we're talking about like war in the air, we're constantly watching the skies. So this is something that's certainly going to affect and probably scare other nations.
And scared me, and I live here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Indiana's, we're taking part in the civil defense drills, and we're making essentially, nuclear devices, and also with just like coordinating, like, with the bomb site you mentioned and other items that were made there. So the stakes are high, and I know I've said it like 3 or 4 times, but stakes are high. How'd that impact the state? Like, how did Indiana deal with the fact that we were caught up in one historical super conflict, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they definitely just tried to educate the public, um, especially like through Bertha Turtle and like, duck and cover stuff, like stuff we just covered. And they also fortified, cities that were really high on the list. So like one of the national projects to fortify cities was called the Nike Missile Project. And we had maybe like 3 or 4 different postings, most of them being up in the Northwest because you're trying to fortify like Chicago. And then there is one in the Southeast, which is Dillsboro, and that was to help fortify Cincinnati. And so, like, these places had like missile launchers and like they had like watchtowers and radio towers to like sort of also scan the skies and make sure that they can stay on top of that. And that's one of the images of the missiles that would have been like stored at these sites. And that's up in our Lanham Gallery. But yeah, I think that Indiana did a lot to sort of fortify um, cities that are especially like could be hit.
What does the Nike missile do? Is it just like it's not an intercontinental ballistic missile, is it?
Yeah, I am not quite sure about that. But I assume they're long-ranging bombers or missiles that could certainly hit other targets.
No, it makes sense. I mean, um, just trying to keep like, and because United States pretty big, understatement of the year, but trying to protect like just thousands of miles of airspace
Yeah.
and landmass. So I imagine we would need a lot of these just to keep us safe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like a cool map that I came across when I was doing research that like showed all these different like um areas where they had sites. So like they had them all across the nation, Alaska especially. But they also had some in like California and Texas and some even in the middle of the country, which you would think is like, oh, why should we be concerned? But that's also a huge part of like I think Kansas was like a major player in sort of developing and researching missiles. So yeah, it makes sense that they would definitely need to fortify all across the nation.
Yeah. So we've been talking about missiles and rockets, but let's talk about something else that's not necessarily related to war and blowing things up. My understanding is that we also helped out with the space race as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have Purdue University, which has been a leading institution for research and development. And especially there's been certain people who've gone into space like Neil Armstrong, Gus Grissom, who's pictured right there, Eugene Cernan, Roger Chaffee, like they were all people who had gone through the program and then had actually helped launch the US's space race in doing their part in either um, being part of missions or going up into space. But yeah, Gus Grissom, he is a Indiana native. He's from Mitchell, Indiana. So they have a really cool tribute to him down there. But yeah, he graduated from Purdue University and then was later called for NASA to like be a part of their program. And he was the second American astronaut in space when he piloted Liberty Bell 7. So in the picture that was there, he is, suited up in front of Liberty Bell 7. And then he unfortunately lost his life on a test run for the Apollo moon program. So like they were like testing, a launch or something, and the capsule just like caught on fire. But yeah, I think he's kind of an underrated but important figure in the space race for sure.
Yeah. Again, it's an era where war is on everyone's minds, but the space program that was very uplifting. where we wanted to beat the Soviets to space, which we didn't, but we did beat them to the moon, which was it was a huge, huge event. And I know that after we landed on the moon, kind of like all the pizzazz died down. But the space program, like I went to Purdue, go Boilermakers, and just seeing all like the stuff that they have there about our contributions to the space program. I have like one more question though regarding the Liberty Bell 7. So you mentioned that like Gus Grissom from Indiana, astronaut. Did Indiana contribute to like the space race in other ways?
I think a lot of their contribution was, sort of training people. I think I don't remember what the statistic is on NASA, but there's certainly a statistic like, there's oftentimes in every like space mission, there's X amount or X% of Purdue alumni. So like they have certainly done a lot to educate and train up and coming astronauts and engineers who work for the space International Space Station and stuff like that. So yeah, I think they're primarily like, it's the research that they really contributed to the space race.
Wow. I think it's great that how Indiana helped us escape Indiana essentially and go up towards the moon. So we've talked about the Cold War, and we've talked about the space program. Let's talk about something else that was going on that was kind of really divisive for the nation at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So part of our exhibit talks about like the peace movement, and also comments a little bit on like the conflict between democracy and communism. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so yeah, it's obviously the Cold War is very ideological, that's centered on ideas and stuff and politics, but also there's, combat warfare, Korea and Vietnam being the ones. And IHS has quite a few collections of individuals who helped or served in some capacity in both Korea and Vietnam. And as I said earlier, like the businesses obviously really helped sort of with the combat aspect of things because, we're producing and developing equipment that'll be used for war. But also, just like the rest of the nation, like there's huge division on whether it was right to be fighting. And so an organization that sort of formed in Indiana is called the Hoosiers for Peace. And this was just like a group of, churches and civic leaders who wanted to create an organization. And so that sort of was their mission. They were organized in like 1967. So that was like, so I think their biggest mission was to, bring an end to Vietnam. And another organization that Indiana had a chapter of was called the Peace Ribbon Project. And that was organized by a lady named Justine Merritt in 1982. And that was like a national thing. And so some people from the Church Women United created a chapter in Indianapolis. And that organization, there's one huge event in 1985 that like people could add, they would create quilts or ribbons. And then what would happen is like in, I think, 1985, their mission was to make a ribbon long enough that could go around the Pentagon as a way of protesting. It's a way of peaceful protest, but also a very huge statement, I think.
Yeah, because it's not just the tensions from nuclear weapons. It was the fact that we had gone to war in Korea, and Korea ended in a stalemate. Right. And then we went to war in Vietnam, and Vietnam ended with a retreat with honor for the United States. Yeah. But the United States was ultimately unsuccessful in keeping the Southern Vietnamese government intact. And a lot of our viewers might remember either they've seen it in films or they've seen footage of like the Fall of Saigon. It was just a huge shift. because I think people expected us to win the Cold War pretty like quickly and handedly, and then we started seeing just like the tide was turning against us, where we were very successful at the beginning of these conflicts, and then suddenly things started to just like it became a prolonged conflict, devastating not just to the U.S. Armed Forces but also to the nation of Vietnam. And it seems like a lot of people were just pretty tired of it. You mentioned the ribbon that went around Washington, D.C. Were there any like major protests here in Indiana?
I think in Bloomington, students had gathered there and had like protested specifically Vietnam there. And there's an image down at IU Bloomington's like archives that's really kind of cool. It's like black and white. You can see all the, the posters and the protest signs that are just, obviously voicing their opinions on the matter. Yeah, and I think IU Bloomington is they were very politically involved in the Cold War. And so I think that was one of the bigger ones that we had.
And also for our audience, the War Memorial downtown, beautiful building. It's also got a lot of exhibits that discuss, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and it has an altar for peace at the very top, which if you can survive the stairs, because the stairs can be a little brutal, but it's a beautiful altar. And I highly recommend checking it out. So we're talking about, the struggles on the home front. People aren't necessarily happy with the conflicts the United States is finding itself in. There's a slide that actually you showed me about was it the Green Feather Movement?
Yeah. So the Green Feather Movement, so along with all this, McCarthyism is going crazy. People are paranoid. We've got, claims of espionage. So everybody is just kind of paranoid. And so one of the things in Indiana that sort of came out of McCarthyism was the Indiana's textbook commissioner at the time wanted to ban Robin Hood from all schools because, it had communist ideals that didn't, support the ideals of democracy. And so she was going to ban it from all schools in Indiana. And there was a group of like 5 students down in Bloomington, Indiana, at IU again, and they protested this. They essentially got like chickens from a nearby somewhere, and they painted like their feathers green, and they like printed out some of these pamphlets, which you can see on the screen. Like that's just got some of their ideals and qualms with what was going on. And yeah, they just kind of let it run loose for a bit, and this movement gained some national attention. I think like schools out in California got kind of involved, people on the East Coast, so it was pretty big for a little bit, but then it died out after about a year. And so yeah, that's just like one example of like how people use their voices to protest or to voice a different opinion.
Hard to believe Robin Hood getting banned. So McCarthyism, which I think kind of sets the tone for the government of the time. And can you tell us a bit more about it was Joe McCarthy?
Yeah, Joseph McCarthy. Yeah.
Joseph
Yeah,
McCarthy.
he basically, I guess he just thought everybody was communist or something, but he held all these trials basically against people who had alleged, communist ties. And like people in Indiana were obviously affected by that. Like there's this scientist, Melba B Phillips, who like had studied under Oppenheimer and like was actually trying to prevent nuclear wars from happening because she saw the effects of it. And she's a Hoosier native but ended up moving out east to New York. And like she lost her job because, she wouldn't testify in front of the committee. And so they fired her because they're like, oh, well, you must be a communist. And And that happened to a woman named Rebecca Pitts, who was like, I think she worked at Butler University, and she was also dismissed from her job under claims of potentially being part of the communist tie, having communist ties. And it's most likely because of things she had written or things she had taught, because I think she's an English professor, so she was fairly, I think, outspoken. But yeah, so like, yeah, I think McCarthyism was certainly like also another like divisive thing in the United States during the Cold War.
Actually, I have a follow-up question for that, but I just want to remind our audience that in 10 minutes, we're going to open up the Q&A section of our program. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's just right at the bottom, and we will try to get through all of your questions at the end of the program. So, we talk about democracy versus communism. It's often symbolized as blue versus red. It feels like during this era that people were very quick to judge. You mentioned how that teacher lost her job because she was accused of teaching communism. Did we see like a lot of that just like echoing throughout the country? Did it really become like an us versus them kind of mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. Like media certainly did not help that. There was a program in also I think Indiana University. So I use like a huge part in Indiana, like in disseminating ideas and opinions. But one of their programs is called the Indiana School of the Sky. And it was like this radio program that was geared towards younger children. And they actually would air these like 15-minute long programs to elementary school age students. And usually it would talk about like just finding jobs, pop culture, like things in the news. But obviously as the Cold War started, they started covering things like that. And a lot of that was like, like East Germany's bad, and like, all these Eastern nations who had fallen under communism had really poor ideals that we don't want to fall into. And so like that was like, so like you could see sort of this mentality in the media. And I'm sure there are other examples of how like radio and TV influenced the way that Americans viewed the enemy or the people who didn't share the same values as them. Yeah.
One of my favorite movies is Top Gun. And in that movie, which is set during the 80s, Maverick, the protagonist, he gets into a conflict at the end with unnamed MiG pilots. And they never quite say that it's the Soviet Union. They never like address it. It's in the Indian Ocean, and they just have it be like, it could be anybody. But they're very clearly, from like the red stars on their helmets to the fact that they're flying MiGs. They did everything but say that they were Russian pilots. And it's just interesting how when you look back at history and at media of the time, that they would go through and just depict them as like this overwhelming force that was just like faceless and a loss of individuality, which I know a lot of critics of communism always talk about. But it's just interesting also when you go back even further and look at even older movies. Platoon's a famous one that talks about the Vietnam War. And also the Bond movies, where I do love Sean Connery and Roger Moore, and having him go toe to toe with KGB agents and with all of the gadgets and everything. And he was very much he was a British spy, but he represented the West, overcoming everybody, from the East. I think it's so interesting to just look at the conflict through that perspective, where we were just, atomic war possibly on the horizon, everything else that's going on, war in Vietnam, and then we're just depicting in our media just all these things where it's like, no, like they're bad, like Robin Hood, where we're looking at Robin Hood, which is a really, really old story that all of us are familiar with, and just the fact that they were wanting to pull it from schools by saying that, oh, it teaches communism, when really, as that slide depicted, he was stealing from the rich to give to the poor because the rich were being oppressive. And it's just so interesting that in this, everything was getting caught up and how that all got caught up in this big, like, oh, I guess, well, Robin Hood's bad too because he's teaching, stand up to bullies and all of that.
Yeah, and I certainly think like there was this mentality that like if you didn't believe in something then that everybody else did, then you must be a bad guy too. That's why like McCarthyism was such a big thing, because it's like, okay, well, if you're not outwardly defying communism, then you must be harboring some, I don't know, sympathies towards it. So it just seems like there's like this almost this groupthink mentality maybe. And maybe that's driven by fear. Yeah, I don't know.
So going back to what we discussed earlier in the program, we were talking about we've talked about, like, a lot of the people who protested against the Vietnam War, and we've talked about people who were part of, like, the Green Feather movement. Were there any like really like pro United States groups? Was there, like, I know we talked about the counterculture and the protests against the government. Were there any? What was the other side of that?
Yeah, I didn't really I guess
Oh, it's
that
okay.
wasn't something that was interested me. So maybe I just slacked on my research on that.
No, you didn't slack on your research. It just occurred to me, and I was in the back of my head. I'm like, oh, I wonder what the other group is. So,
Yeah,
but
I mean, yeah, I think there's definitely, politicians who are like, pro McCarthyism. I think like there's a senator like William Jenner, maybe. But I don't know much about him. And I just know that maybe he was um sort of part of that McCarthyism.
so shifting more to like just a national scale. Numerous presidents who are famous for their speeches about the Soviet Union. We've got John F. Kennedy, we've got Lyndon B. Johnson, we've got Richard Nixon, and then eventually it goes all the way up to Ronald Reagan. As the Cold War slowly started to die down, essentially, because we've got 1940s, 1945 up to about 60s or 70s. We're looking at like the height of the Cold War. And then we're entering into that 1980s era where the Soviet Union, I think, just slowly starts to change. What can you tell us about that?
As far as what?
Anything? I don't know. It's just interesting how we talked about how they were like the faceless bad guys, and then obviously in the 90s the Soviet Union collapsed. How did just the Cold War just slowly change from our national perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the Soviets were sort of losing some of their satellites, and so that sort of weakened this power that we thought was, all powerful and scary. And so I think just with any natural thing, there's got to be some kind of shift in how we perceive maybe our opposition. And so I think that sort of helped. And then obviously like the fall of the Berlin Wall, like huge shift in like how we understood our relationship with like Germany. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember we were talking earlier. I was talking about when I was a kid, and I see footage about the fall of the Berlin Wall. Can you tell our audience something about what is the Berlin Wall?
So the Berlin Wall was just this division between East and West Germany, and East and West Germany came about in World War II. And so basically they're trying to cut up Germany because it lost. So it's like, okay, what nation gets what part of Germany? So the Western portion was, given to the Western powers, and then East Germany fell under Soviet reign or Soviet powers. And so yeah, the wall was just like a very visible separation even of ideologies there too.
And yeah, it was a literal wall.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you look at photographs of it. If you look at the wall from the Western side, it's covered in graffiti and sometimes graphic graffiti. I found a website that did like just a photo scroll of a lot of the recorded graffiti on the Western side. And, it's making fun of all the famous Soviet leaders. And it's talking about how, America was so great. And then you look at it from the eastern side, and it is a very pristine and clean wall because of how, I guess, brutally efficient the Soviets kept it clean.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the part of the program where we're going to start answering questions from our audience. If you have any questions, remember, just put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the chat. And for our first question is from Dorothy. And she was wondering if we would talk about steel production in Northwest Indiana and its impact on the Cold War.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so yeah, there's definitely a lot of businesses out on Northwest. And I didn't do like a whole lot of research on that, but obviously my assumption is that it would have gone into, military equipment and missiles, and like the nice Nike missile launchers were not that far from, I mean, they're in Portage and Porter, Indiana. So that's, very, very close to like the steel mill production. So I assume that they probably used a lot of that production to help them, create missiles and then store them. Because if you see that like they've got missile doors that like are under, it pops out from underground. And so I imagine that was probably a big part of the business there, is just making like steel doors, for example, that sort of stored the missiles.
I think it's so interesting how like these many small like towns essentially pop up, and they're providing homes to people who work at these steel mills and at our many military bases. And it's just interesting how like for a lot of the nation, not just Indiana, but just all across the nation, where these small economies just start to form, where it's about maybe this town is just where people who worked at the plant, they live there. Or maybe this town would had a lot of diners because people who worked at a local military base would go out and get lunch. So I just want to think it's very like the steel that was produced there most definitely probably ended up in a lot of the missiles that we were creating. And if not that, a lot of the armaments. I know Indiana actually had a couple munitions plants, and they provided everything from shells to bullets to, I believe one of the plants actually just provided like the buttons and belts that was used in GI uniforms.
Yeah.
Which I just think it's amazing that there's a soldier who went over to go fight in Korea, and his jacket was held together by little pieces of metal that were made right here in Indiana. But yeah, just naval avionics, the steel mills, all the research labs and military bases, Crane Naval Base, which is also a prominent naval base in Indiana. It's just so interesting to see like how we changed as a state, because we're Hoosiers and we did our part, but it's just so like seeing where we fit in, even if it's just like making like small bits that go into uniforms or into machines, or if it's making those Nike missiles, which I learned that it's named after the goddess of victory.
Oh, I did not know that.
Oh, I'm
Cool
full of random
fact.
trivia. There are just times when I would just Google things and be like, it can't be shoe. Why would they name it after a shoe?
Yeah, no, I love that. That's cool. Yeah, I didn't think about like the namesake, so that's cool.
That's just how my brain works, where you could go on and on about like an interesting thing about missiles, and my brain will immediately go, but is it the swoosh? It can't be the swoosh. So our next question. Do you have any idea of the cost of the arms race and the Cold War? Opponents of the weapons and military race say this money should be spent on other programs like education and health.
Yeah, I have no idea how much went into it, but I imagine over a 50-year-long conflict, there was a lot of resources that went into it. Even when we weren't like fighting, combat wars like Korea and Vietnam, but like, we're still fortifying these cities, and we're still creating these watchtowers for people to sort of watch for things. So yeah, I don't know the exact amount, but I imagine they went through a lot.
Because the United States really had a global reach. And for many reviewers who might not be aware of this, we now have military bases in a lot of nations around the world. But back then, we were really starting to stretch out, and we were involved in a lot of conflicts. Korean War and the Vietnam War were some of the biggest. But yeah, it's just so interesting to see how much money we've spent on the national defense, and we'll probably never really know. I mean, there's a lot of classified projects. I know the space race, which took up a lot of our funding throughout the
Yeah,
late 50s or throughout the 60s.
yeah,
Probably gonna get those dates wrong. But yeah, we'll probably never know how much money was spent on the Cold War.
yeah. Yeah, of course, like, obviously, I didn't even think about, like, the technological things that were going on, the research that was going into, like, yeah, space race and stuff, so certainly adds to it.
All right. So for our next question, someone has a question about the Ground Observer Corps. In early 1950s Indiana, where did they think the enemy planes were going to come from?
Um, I assume they, so, like, the United States can make missiles that are far-reaching, and so I assume it's just anything that could have come from enemy territory. I'm not even sure. I think there was so much fear and there was so much paranoia, and the best that they could do was to try to protect themselves at all costs. And I think if you're consumed with that mentality, then it's probably easy to sort of think that just watching for anything in the sky would be advantageous.
We have another question. Do you think we have anything to fear now from other countries like Russia, China, or North Korea? Have we made a mistake in not focusing more on mass weapons?
Mm, I think we're always gonna have tensions, um, and I think that's just how it's gonna be. And I think that's probably what I'm comfortable with saying on that. It's
Yeah.
just so political, so it's like I think there's always gonna be some tension. So
Yeah. I think it's interesting how Russia has changed from a U.S. perspective, where in the 90s, when the Soviet Union fell, they were often depicted in U.S. media as being this lawless place. I remember like one of the first Bond movies that came out after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's depicted as a place where like the mafia is everywhere and controls everything. And then throughout the 21st century, they've slowly built themselves back up into being probably not as big of a threat as the Soviet Union was, at least not so much an immediate threat with nuclear weapons.
mhm.
But it's interesting. It's interesting seeing them, just sort of become. Again, I don't want to say anything that's any like kind of controversial, but they're still a very they're a prominent threat in U.S. politics, and so seeing them kind of like come back again.
Yeah.
All right. For our next question, and this one's a long one. It's from Doug Dixon. So much of this talk is focused on national versus Indiana. I wonder if it might be more useful to talk about what IHS Archives has to offer the audience. And just for grins, there's a fun IU-related article that I wrote on a more personal connection between my personal Indiana-related experience with Coach Sam Bell and my genealogy. At Journal of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Indiana University Cold War era genealogy, online at Google. Is there stuff like this from Hoosiers who have contributed to the IHS archives?
Yeah, so I know the IHS has a lot of collections of people who served in Korea and Vietnam. Those did not make it into like the exhibit that we have, but like that's also like if you want to go into like individual history, like that's something that's there and free for people to research. And it's really interesting to see how people contributed to such global things that are going on. I think there's also some stuff about politicians of the time. I think Vance Hartke he had visited Indiana a few times, but like for various things. And so I think there's a whole like collection on his materials and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that if you wanted to find something, there's a lot of connections there.
I know that for my link with the Cold War in general, my former neighbor John Jones, he fought in Korea, and he would talk about it just all the time. and talking about his experience. And he was part of a radar station and talking about just like his perspective of what they saw, because they were, I remember him telling me that they were told that at any second they were just going to die from an atomic blast, because that's what their superiors had told them, and how there was a very demoralized feeling where for the first time we have, and again, I don't want to I know I've mentioned this repeatedly, and I know that the audience here is probably well aware of nuclear weapons and their devastation, but people who were like drafted to serve in this conflict or who enlisted, and being told that you're going to war and you're going up against this enormous enemy, which was North Korea and China at the time. But just the fact that from his perspective, he was like, yeah, so we just had to go about our day servicing this radar station, eating our meals, manning our guard posts, all thinking we are going to be dead tomorrow, not from enemy attacks, just from an enormous explosion. So I think it's interesting learning about people's experiences, especially for Hoosiers, who were just taking part in this on the grand stage of what was one of the biggest conflicts fought in global history.
Right.
All right. So where did you run across info on the Green Feather movement? I've heard of it, but it's not particularly well known.
Yeah, actually, so Indiana, the IHS does have a collection about the Green Feather movement. And so when I was just researching voices of opposition, that's what came up, and it was really interesting to go up there and sort of read through some of that stuff, because I definitely had never heard of it, and yeah, it doesn't seem to be a very well-known subject at all. But I think it's a really interesting movement. Yeah, so I just came across it at IHS Collections, and yeah, they've got a small box of stuff. So if you want to go check that out too, it's up there.
So we've only got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to ask you, because you had a big hand with helping with the exhibit upstairs and with the collection. What are your favorite parts of the exhibit?
Yeah, my favorite part was definitely the Green Feather movement. I think it's just because I learned something new and different that I'd never learned about. So that was a really cool moment of digging into something that I had no idea of anything about it. But also just I think the space race is always fascinating, and to give Tabitha a lot of credit, she's a graphic designer. She made it look amazing up there. So if you have the opportunity, I think you should definitely go look at it and enjoy it, because it's I think a very neat exhibit, and just all the elements just came together really nicely.
Yeah, I know we had to cover an enormous subject.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that our exhibit does a really good job of just summing up just Indiana's involvement, and it's got some amazing pictures. And also part of our archives are helped out with some our guests in our audience and other people who bring us their collections, bring us pictures. And it's really nice to look back and to see, just to see history. And for some of us, we're reminded of it, and for others of us, you learn new things all the time. For me, learning about what the Nike missile was, I know I said it as a joke, but it was that's actually really cool. And then this Green Feather Society, where I really want to know more. And just with everything that was changing from protests at IU campus and being part of the national defense, it's just a remarkable period of history. And again, I know that we could probably, you'll probably spend multiple history happy hours talking about it, because we had to take big conflict, put it into a little bowl for everyone. But do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this time to talk about it, and I hope everybody else enjoyed and learned something new, because I think Indiana did play a really integral part in the Cold War, and it's hard to imagine that since we are in the middle of nowhere kind of. So I don't know, it's just really interesting to see that connection, and yeah, so I hope you guys enjoy.
All right, and with that, we're going to end our program. Thank you so much, Zoe. Like I said, I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did too. It's just always really great to just just go through history, and especially with just the scale of the conflict and how it touched every aspect of American life. I mean, we talked about movies, we talked about the military, we talked about just life on the home front, we talked about McCarthyism. dozens of subjects, and it's just, I'm pretty proud of my state and our role in this grand conflict. And for our audience, thank you for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. Our History Happy Hour continues next month on October 19th, where we will be discussing costume balls through the ages with Karen DePau. Then on November 10th, our History Happy Hour continues with Hoosier Latinos with our guest, Nicole Martinez-Legrand, our Multicultural Collections Coordinator. You can sign up for these in-person and virtual events at www.indianahistory.org/visit/calendar. And we'll post this conversation to the IHS YouTube channel and on our website in the upcoming weeks. In the meantime, if you'd like to revisit any of our previous free programs, you can check out the History Happy Hour playlist on YouTube or at the link in the chat. If you missed your chance to donate and would like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, please visit indianahistory.org/contribute/donate. Your donation will allow us to continue to share Hoosier stories and to fund events just like this one. You'll be prompted at the close of the webinar to take a 1-minute survey, and we'd love to know what you thought of tonight and also what topics you'd be interested in learning more about. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you to our audience. I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and we can't wait to see you in person or virtually again. Bye, everybody.